we can take as anthropologists, as educators and professionals,
Right.
um, and try and make our field better and our students better and the
Yeah.
community better
Yeah.
by furthering uh, communication.
Yeah.
So yeah. So
Yeah.
anyway, I just want to throw that out there. If people want to grab some lunch, if they want to
I
shoot the
will.
breeze, please do so. This is our time to kind of um, you know meet and greet and have a good
Okay.
time. So
Okay. I'm going to go get my lunch.
yeah.
I got to go make lunch for family, but I will be back
I
shortly.
will be right back. Yeah. As soon as I finish making my lunch.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sounds good.
And I'm going to have to jump off to meet with the person I'm presenting with. But first, I wanted to introduce Ryan Weaver. He's someone who popped in. He's been part of an informal anthro hangout group that we've formed to kind of cope with the general lack of opportunity to talk shop and enjoy a community of practice.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I wanted to offer that introduction.
Cool. Welcome, Ryan. Um, I think we've seen you around before, so at least I know I recognize the name. Um, yeah, cool. Very cool. Yeah, so if people want to grab food and then come back or shoot the breeze with whoever is here, then great. Uh, Otherwise, we'll be meeting back.
That's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go grab something and bring it here. And if it's too ugly, I'll turn my screen off. You can tell me. Um, this is so wonderful. And Kenzie, it is so good to see you and hear you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I wait for this like all year, y'all. Like
I'm sorry.
I wait for this like all year until we get together again. I'm just really happy I'm getting to be able to do this thanks to the
Oh, this is wonderful.
new normal, but it's really influenced a lot of the work that I'm doing now, and something that I talked about with I gave a presentation at Michigan last December on sort of like anthropology, ethnography, and creative writing, and this is one of the things that I brought up is this idea of like community, and that your work really isn't going to be as good as it could be unless you have that community of other people who are doing similar work, or who are doing their own work who inspire you. I just feel like there's that element that would be missing with, some of us end up in this situation where we end up kind of in isolation doing it later, because I'm teaching in an English department now, and I'm hoping to cross teach at some point, but I'm not like an official anthropologist per se. Um, but that's always been where my work has come from. It's always been like where I've started from in everything that I do, and it's been my first love. So it's just really nice to be able to kind of keep practicing because of this community. Like I think I would feel so disconnected, and I wouldn't feel like I had any place doing it if I didn't have High Plains and Howard come into my life.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think Kenzie, you bring up a good point, and it's something that I want to touch on. Is that our community, we're this is anthropology, but we we bring in as many people as we possibly can. And that's what really made me kind of fall in love with High Plains is the fact that it's so inclusive, not only on who we want to have a part of our society, because the more views that we can bring in, the better off it's going to be. But I think that especially with how I got started as an undergraduate, and how many professional societies encourage undergraduate students to participate and to share and to present and to do all of that stuff. You know, it's a great community that fosters that. And so, as far as you're concerned, you're just as much one of us. You don't have to have the degree, because that doesn't matter. What we're doing, that's the important part.
Yep, 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 yep.
What we're doing and how we're doing it and the approaches that we take and the people that we bring along with us to engage in our various communities. That's the important thing. So, you know, the rest of it, you know, and that's again, that's why I love anthropology, is because it's holistic,
Yeah.
right? You know, it's everything, every aspect of culture, and that goes into writing, that goes into language, it goes into technology and science. All of those things are an aspect of anthropology as we study. So, you know, I just want to say thank you for, um, you know, for bringing your insight and ideas in, and everyone else that's been doing this too. It's fantastic. So, you know, thank you very much.
Yeah, I think it's important to remember that anthropology is a verb, not a noun.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's what I was thinking about with Michael's
Mike, with
Michael's
Michael.
presentation about when we're talking about like these intro classes, and I'm thinking about this kind of like overarching disdain for applied anthropology sometimes.
Yes, there is that.
When I was doing, because I did an undergraduate degree in anthropology, that was the degree that I chose, and for me that served me so much better than an English degree would have. My work is so much different than it would have been if I just, it sort of would have been more of the history lesson that we were talking about. I feel like a lot of English is, and if I had known that applied anthropology was even a thing early on, like I know they talked about it with me, but it wasn't really talked about other than just being, oh, this is one of the other lesser known stepchildren subfields or something.
Yeah.
And if that had been shown to me, but that's what's so exciting about that framework, and that practical sort of approach to teaching anthropology, is that you say to everyone can be an anthropologist in their world. Everyone can do these things and interact with culture on a deeper level. And to say to students, like, each one of you can do this out in the world, and you can make a difference in the world by doing it. Because the sort of like lofty, I don't know if this is even real or something that we tell ourselves, but the lofty idea of anthropology as removed and as austere, like once you break that bubble, you start to open it up to everyone can be involved. And then we can also show that the work matters, and that the work needs to be funded, and that the work needs to be like happening. We can make our outputs more accessible to the people that we're working with. I will say working with instead of studying.
Yes.
Yes. Yes.
Right.
So I think it's a really exciting sort of way to start shifting not only the way that we teach anthropology, but the way that applied anthropology is recognized within the field of anthropology. If you have students already doing applied anthropology on day one, and then you get to tell them, hey, you can actually go out and make a difference in a community with this. You can help make a difference in terms of affordable housing, in terms of water access. You can actually shift the world for the better. I think what I'm seeing with my students in my creative writing classes right now is they seem primed for the anthropology side of things. So I'm pushing that. But they really care. They really care about the world that they're living in. They care about each other.
Yeah, they do.
They care about moving through the world in a good way. And this just would give them the opportunity to do that and to feel like, oh, I have something I can do in the world. When we're so overwhelmed by things that are outside of our control, oh, this is something that I can do. This is a skill I can feel like I'm getting good at. I can go out in the world and I can change the world for the better. You kind of key into, I think it's an aspect of that generation. I really do, that they care about people and that they want to make their world better. So this being like one of those, I think it's such a core way of doing that. But not enough people know about it. And so start changing that sort of conversation that's happening between the applied anthropologists and the rest of anthropology, I guess. I feel like they're all secret applied anthropologists and they just don't know it yet.
Well, you know, and I want to kind of mention something about that, is that, you know, applied anthropology for a long time was its own subfield. and we treated the other branches of anthropology as these scientific approaches that
Yeah.
would be we're supposed to be separated from and doing it for knowledge sake, and I do think that a lot of anthropologists are starting to take on more and more applied approaches because the field is evolving, and I think that archaeologists and linguists and are starting to pick up on the fact that they are engaging with people. And if we're going to engage with people effectively, we have to change the approach. And by applying these, applied techniques and incorporating them into these practices, we're going to see anthropology in general, not just our little subfield or cultural, we're going to see a transformation. And that can only be good, that can only be good. And I think about the origin story of High Plains in the first place and how it was a reaction to applied anthropology being ostracized and looked down upon, and how this society came together and said, this is important to us, this approach is important, we need to stay together and focus. And now I think we're at a turning point within our society that and within anthropology that we need to be reaching out and not just bringing in other applied anthropologists or cultural, but having the linguists and having the physical anthropologists come in and sharing their information, and not just anthropology. I think that we need to even reach out further into other fields and say, listen, yeah, you might be an engineer, you might be a nurse, you might be, whatever. You have a place here because the things that we're talking about, the things that we're teaching, has relevance in your life and in your field to make things better for all of us to, have a better life and have a better existence and learn more about people, because we're not going to get any less diverse. I mean, seriously, we're not getting any less diverse than we are now. It's only going to become more. So
Yeah.
we need to encourage that and to expand upon it and to celebrate it.
Absolutely.
And if we can do that, I think we've got a good chance. I have hope. I have hope for us all. So, rawr.
Yeah, I mean, everything you just said, Joe, is exactly why me and Kira wrote this whole book, because we want creative people who are not anthropologists to think about the lens of anthropology, right?
Yeah.
We
Yeah.
want people who maybe have never even taken an anthropology class to look at that book and be like, huh, I should really consider this other idea, and maybe this will make my characters in fiction better and less formulaic, right? So I mean, that everything you just said is exactly was the inspiration for working on that book in the first place. So
Awesome.
Yeah,
Yeah.
well, and that's something that I think all of us share. That's why we're all here,
Yeah.
is to go out and you know create those worlds to help people better understand
Yeah.
what people's lives are like, and to create those bridges.
Yeah.
So, and that's where you know eh, that's where I find my joy, especially in this community, is finding all of these like-minded people that that share these same ideals.
Yeah.
It's
But then
pretty awesome.
we aren't
Hello,
just like
everyone.
sitting with the knowledge. Like we're not just going out there and okay, we're much better at understanding people now. That's what, to me, what applied anthropology has always offered is to say, okay, you have the tools now. Now go out and do it. Go
Do it.
out and make the thing happen, or go
Mhm.
out and work with people. And I think that I look back at like anthropology, my first love. I started out more in the cultural side of things, moved to biological, did some archaeology, like been across the board with it.
Yeah.
But that sort of old school approach of that psychic distance, we know that that's always been a false paradigm.
Yeah.
And so in a way, like I see that sort of emergence that I'm hoping for, that emergence of applied, kind of helping us shift the way that we think about like the other areas of anthropology and helping them shift the way they think about it, because that's always been a false paradigm. Like you never had truly removed observation. You always had some form of participant observation.
Right.
And so the real question then becomes, what is your responsibility as a participant? What is your role as a participant? And I think that that's something that applied anthropology has already developed so many different frameworks for being able to look at that question.
Right.
So crossing our fingers, here's hoping. But I just feel like it's been, it's sort of been set aside the same way that one might set aside the responsibility to do more.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I'll be back as soon as I can.
Okay. We'll see you in a bit, Howard.
I might grab lunch too.
Okay.
Bye.
Michael, Alyssa, hello. How you guys doing?
Hey, Joe. Thank you. Yeah, I was just getting ready to say hi, and there's some people in the call that we know and some we don't. So I'm just going to say hello. I'm Michael Bridge, and
Alyssa Camp.
this is Alyssa Camp. So hello, and thank you for letting us join.
Absolutely. Peter, it's nice to see you. Oh, and who? Yep.
I was going to mention, Joe, it's really cool you talk about bringing architects and the engineers into the fold, because that's really where we've seen some of our work grow in the last couple years, is people bringing us in as part of like architectural design teams and things. And likely one day, I mean, there's areas where we're starting to have work in that, but likely one day as applied anthropologists and architects begin to work more, our role wouldn't be necessary in that, because the reason they bring us in is because they're admittedly, and to work with anybody that's admittedly doing anything, it's great when people admit their weaknesses. But the reason we've been brought in that fold is they're like, look, we want to work in Indian country, but we don't do the best in conveying our ideas or displaying the community's vision in the designs that we build. So we want to hire you all on to be a part of our integrated design team to make sure that you are collecting information through various types of people in the community, whether they be elders or youth or artists, artisans, etc., and make sure that their visions bleed through the final design, whether it be a community building or something. So that's been really cool and fun, but even cooler to know that, like what you said, I mean, as those relationships continue to build, for that particular instance, one day Sweetgrass's being a mediary or liaison won't need to happen.
I think, and what you're saying, especially about being that intermediary, I think the elimination of that would be awesome. Like, not that I want to see you guys out of a job, but
there'll be something else.
If we can get to a point where, we no longer need to have that bridge in place, and people can, communicate in meaningful ways and address the questions and the issues and all of that stuff without, having those barriers. I can only see positive things coming forth. So, and I think that because of the way that our society is growing, I think the way that anthropology is changing, and I think how we're incorporating more and more applied techniques into all these different fields, that, reaching out and trying to bring people in that could benefit from applied anthropology can only be a positive. So and we're a small society, and I there are some very good things about that, because we're very tight knit. Everyone here, we all pretty much know each other, and we've engaged with each other for years. But I think that, branching out and bringing in other people, and maybe setting it up so that there's, different training sessions and different ways that we can engage the public and engage other communities and other, I mean, maybe hooking up with another um, community, like I don't know, what am I thinking of, like an engineering conference, that has that same sort of community. Can we engage with them and then intermix? Like, what can we learn from them? How can we look at how they do things and how they interact with their their companies and how they do their own research and all of that? How can we engage, and then how can we make it better for them to engage? So, reaching out, I think, is something that we need to do. We should approach it in a way that's beneficial for us and for everyone else. So, yeah, but I just believe that we can't get any worse off if we bring in more people, and if we bring in more diversity, not only in the people themselves, but in the diversity of the field, and anthropology, as we've been kind of talking about, almost doesn't seem like a field anymore. It feels like a practice. That to be an anthropologist, we follow these certain guidelines and we do this research, but it's more about understanding people and helping people understand themselves. And it's something that I bring up with my students all the time. It's like, listen, before you can understand someone else, you have to understand yourself. You have to create that understanding of internal bias, understand where you're coming from before you can even attempt to try and understand someone else, because you have to have a reference point, because we can't get away from bias, right? It's impossible to get away from it. So we have to acknowledge it. So I think that as we're processing all of this, as we're thinking outside of the box, as we're trying to readjust what we're going to see in the future, I think there's a lot of cool things that we could do. So yeah, that's that. I mean, I'm just throwing that out there. I think there's so much possibility. So
Hey, Joe.
Yeah.
Hey, I just wanted to say hi and show my face. I've been enjoying the conversation and all the presentations. I've been listening, kind of feeling like a little bit of a lurker here because been multitasking for sure today, a lot going on. But this has been a great way to keep my head space occupied while my body's doing other things. Also, just to like throw it out, like, I don't know if I'm the only linguist in the room, so to speak, but yeah, a lot is happening with linguistic anthropology and this kind of applied perspective, especially like with our language documentation programs and stuff like that working on. I mean, that whole area used to be this thing where it was like a linguist who didn't know anything about culture would go in and work with a group, and sometimes not really even work with a community. They would just kind of elicit some information about the language and then write up a grammar, and that would be it. And that's such a piss poor way to do any kind of linguistics or any kind of community-based program. So now it's like this very interdisciplinary thing where the community kind of runs the programs, the projects, and of course they have the first and most important say in what happens and how things run. That's kind of the gold standard anyways. And linguists are there as facilitators and doing what needs to be done, sometimes training native speakers on how to use technologies and sometimes writing grammar, sometimes not, sometimes just doing completely things that I think in the past linguists would not have even thought of as linguistics because in the end, there's no right way to do a language documentation, revitalization, and reclamation project. It's different from place to place. So yeah, the applied thing has definitely taken hold there, at least in that little sub area of linguistic anthropology. And I think it's pretty amazing actually to watch it develop.
Yeah, I think there's so much going on, especially when we're looking at how this is going. I was thinking about what you were saying, this kind of dealing with this concept of like polyvocality, where people are, engaging in their own exercise of expression, right? As if you're going to go in and you're going to record a language, having them a part of it, having them help direct it and how it's going to get used, it changes. We look at how anthropologists used to do things, and it was all about going out and creating these theories about how people live, and it very often did not involve the people themselves. It was just the anthropological eye. It was just their viewpoint, and that's no longer acceptable. That is an approach that we can no longer use because it does not engage the agency of that community. And so, by employing these applied techniques, everyone else is going to benefit from this experience and this knowledge base. And I honestly believe that more importantly than learning anthropological theory, of looking at all of the past anthropologists and what they did and the history and their research, I think directing our attention more towards skill sets and the practical side of anthropology. If they want to learn about historical anthropology, have a class for it. But I think if we're going to talk about how to do it, and especially with intro courses, because they're not going to follow. They're not going to go into anthropology. They're doing it as a side class, as a core class. But if we can get them interested and give them a skill set that can benefit them, I think we'll see huge improvements in how people, behave in just real life. I mean, if everybody took an anthropology class, there'd be no war. There'd be, there wouldn't be any civil strife. Everybody would be fed, because we'd all understand each other, right? We'd all have this basic understanding of decency and have some idea of acceptance. And maybe I'm getting ahead of myself. Maybe I'm, getting a little crazy with anthropology. But I mean, honestly, I don't think there's very many fields out there like anthro. So
I don't either. They're not holistic.
Yeah.
They're not holistic.
Yeah, and that is something that is so hugely beneficial when we're looking at problems.
Yes.
When we're looking at our own problems,
Mhm.
asking why. It's like, well, we've got this problem, so this is how we fix it. Well, do we actually understand that problem? Do we actually understand the intricacies of going in and fixing it? And how can we actually do it? And how do we address what people think the problem is versus what the actual problem is? That sort of ground truth and theoretical truth that we face. That yeah, there might be problems, but they might not be the problems you think. So yeah, that holistic approach and can benefit so many people. So
holistic, but we always have to remember to be critical of ourselves, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Because I mean, even we have like a pretty easy dark past to look to in anthropology, but there's even stuff that didn't seem like it was so dark, but now we understand that, like even in linguistics, a lot of the whole thing about a linguistic anthropologist or whatever would go in and work on a language with the community, but they would represent language in a way that was actually very different than the people themselves understood language as. But it had this authority of anthropology, of linguistics, So that version of language was the one that would get taught in the schools afterwards. And all of a sudden, the linguist and the anthropologists who go in to, help a community revitalize language and culture ended up changing it in a way that didn't actually do any good. And this has happened over and over again. So that the language that and the culture, these things that were being taught in schools were very specific, narrowed, kind of Western, so to speak. Sometimes I don't like using that term, but versions of what that kind of culture was. And that's not good, and that can create rifts in communities. So anyways, the point being, always be on your toes and be very critical and yourself.
I was thinking that, and you were saying, Western, I'm thinking colonial.
Colonial, yeah.
This approach that, and I think that's why, again, why applied anthro is so important, and why we need to address and invite people that don't follow that same Western education that we all received going to these, to Western universities, and and engaging in Western language, and addressing this as like, okay, what is your viewpoint on anthropology? Being an outsider from this Western idealism, and and I think that as a society, and certainly as individuals, we have to look at these biases that we have created that for ourselves, and you can't avoid them. You grow up in this way, we learn this way, but we can adapt ourselves to engage in these other conversations and to have other people come in and bring in their different ideas. And so I think, finding out how to bridge that gap, and engaging in different concepts. And that's what I think anthropology is starting to do in other countries and other cultures, where they're kind of discarding this Western approach.
Right.
And that needs to be done.
Yeah.
And to engage in those conversations.
Just wanted to kind of, off of what Rich was saying, it made me think about the work of Bernard Purley, who's a linguistic anthropologist. He's also Maliseet of the Wabanaki Confederacy. And so he's got these wonderful essays, and I'm always so excited because I think I mentioned this last time we met. Like, I quote his essays all the time, but I don't have a book of them to be able to cite. As far as like when you're trying to get your book list for a PhD, you need like 3 essays equals a book. So I'm like, can't you just give me the book so I can quote 4 essays? But he hadn't put out a book of the essays because that wasn't the currency for tenure where he was. He had to do more monographs, and he does monographs, but these essays were getting sort of set to the side because of that. And they're so foundational, in my opinion anyway. There's an essay that he wrote called Zombie Linguistics, which is about that idea of these linguists, particularly outsiders, coming in and recording language and then leaving again, and they don't necessarily give back to the community in any way. It doesn't necessarily help the community anyway, but it also creates this zombie, like they're the zombies trying to eat the brains, just the brains. And then also the language becomes this sort of like disembodied, strange thing that doesn't really have any meaning in the end, because language lives in community. And that's what he keeps sort of coming back to, is that language lives in community. That's the only way language can evolve. That's the only way language can adapt and find new uses. He talks about emerging vitalities is another one of his essays and concepts, where you have different uses of language for different reasons coming out of those communities. Kind of like, as the kids say these days, all the good memes, like they're using language in new ways. Those same emergent vitalities are seen in language use in communities that you do not have when you have these like recorded, this idea of preservation. And I think that that's another thing that's happening in these, like, in the archives of anthropology is that we had this sort of, we were trying to create an archive when language and culture lives in communities. And so with the linguistic aspect of it, I also think about like my own tribe's efforts at revitalizing language, because it's also you have to think about your approach when you are working with them, even when it's your own people. You have to think about what is the better approach, because we, like the younger generation, internalizes a lot of the approaches that we see in the world around us. And so what they did is they went to the elders here, the few that we have left that are speaking as a first language. I think we have less than 30. It might be less than 20 at this point, actually. And we have our cohorts in Canada, the Canadian Oneidas, who I'm very excited to get to meet here soon now that I'm in Canada. But they kind of have a slightly different dialect as well. So I really want to see like the Green Bay dialect be like revitalized rather than preserved. Although at some point you get so anxious about it, you're like, preservation at least. But anyway, the people who were trying to write down the language went to our elders and they asked them, like, how would you say good morning? And the elders were like, I don't know. And, you know, sometimes when you're working with them, you do ask them a couple times, or you ask them in a couple ways to see if you can kind of like jog the thinking on both ends to connect. But if you ask them too many times, they will either just make something up to satisfy you, or they'll play a joke on you, because they do love playing tricks on us. So I was just talking to my one of my mentors there the other day, and he was like, yeah, Segu, he was like, Seguli. And I was like, oh, shouldn't it be Segu? Because when you're talking to a woman, and he's like, no, that was Maria's idea. You know exactly who the people are who were working on the language, because there's not many of them. No, that was Maria's idea. She just thought it would be more formal. And then he told me the story about good morning. And at some point it was like a combination of them playing a joke on us in even telling us there was a phrase for good morning, because there wasn't. And they came up with the phrase being more along the lines of, if you were inside in a factory, say, all night working, and then someone else came in, you might say, like, how's the sun out there? And that was the sort of idea behind good morning. And yet everyone, like almost everyone on my reservation right now, just like uses that phrase like unironically all the time. And I'm like, okay, yeah, good morning. But I can't get it out of my head that this was a joke that the elders were playing on us, but it gets written down that way. And then, like what Rich was saying, it gets kind of warped a little bit, sometimes intentionally, like, or sometimes like through disregard rather. And then sometimes through just these like weird little things that happen, or people, like the elders like to play a lot of jokes. So you won't have all that if all you do is write down the material and you don't look at the community usage and the cultural sort of context of it and who exactly it is you're speaking to. Like, they have their own character, they have their own sort of storytelling approach. So it's just really, it's more fun when you get down into those little details of it than just handing someone the book that says good morning. Something like that. I'm still working on my pronunciation, but I don't even think I've tried to memorize that one, because as soon as I heard the story behind it, I was like, oh, okay.
I posted the link to Zombie Linguistics.
I recommend his work on zombie linguistics, emerging vitalities. And then he also has an essay along with language revitalizationists, Margaret Newton, who's an Anishinaabe, and Daryl Baldwin, who worked on the revitalization of the Miami language. Fantastic sort of story there, and has put out, I think it was Miami Dreaming might be the name of the documentary that he did, but it's so useful, especially even for teaching classes about language revitalization, and the fact that they brought back the Miami language from just having the place names. That was all they had, and a few like missionary produced dictionaries and things like that. And through kind of imagining the language rather than being this idea of dead or dying, which I think is usually the way that it gets described in the larger world. What if instead of saying it was dead or dying or at risk of death, what if you just said it was sleeping?
Yeah.
It was sleeping and it was just waiting to be awoken again.
Mm-hmm.
And what would that bring to the way we approach language revitalization? And through that process, they actually brought back that language into daily use, as far as like Daryl Baldwin's kids are like one of the new generation that is actually growing up speaking Miami in their home.
Oh, that's fabulous.
That's cool.
Yeah.
And so Pearlie wrote this really fabulous essay with Daryl Baldwin and with Margaret Newton about the idea of extinction being a colonial concept. I thought this might be useful for Michael's work as well, Michael and Kira, as far as is extinction or even this idea of genocide, isn't that a colonial concept in the first place? This idea that things have to die out or they're inevitably going to die out. And so the extinction of language, the extinction of cultures, the extinction of morals and ideals, like none of that is set in stone. None of that is inevitable. And so what does it do when we think of that in terms of inevitability? And what does it mean when we start thinking, okay, even the idea of extinction may be a colonial concept, and what other concepts are available?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that reminds me of a conversation I had with one of my professors in grad school when we talked about the collapse of the Anasazi, right? The whole collapse problem, and Jared Diamond's work and all that stuff, and how there's just this assumption that things just disappear forever, right? But in reality, what they do is they transform. Those same groups spread across the American Southwest and integrated their knowledge into the other knowledge systems in the region, right? And they didn't collapse, they transformed.
Mm-hmm.
And it's such like a concept, and it's almost in a weird way, it's almost a justification for this ethnic cleansing and genocide, because oh look, this has happened in the past. Peoples die off, they become extinct, so what's the big deal if it's natural cultural evolution, right? It's very much that along those lines, very much along those lines.
Also imperial nostalgia, to bring Renato Rosaldo back in, like
Mm-hmm.
that's the go-to for everything. But it's that, and it's that same instinct, I think, behind when, because I have students in my American Indian Studies classes who are like, we said earlier, oh, I didn't know y'all still
Yeah.
Oh my
existed. And I can be standing right in front of them and they're like, oh, okay. But I think it's that sort of, I tell them, like, it's incentivized. It's beneficial to think of us as dead and gone.
Yeah.
And it is actually emotionally satisfying in a way to think of the dead and gone and to be wistful about that, even as you are probably complicit in that process.
Yeah.
So there's this kind of like overarching imperial nostalgia that I think is behind like most of the ethos of the United States as a country.
Yes.
Because if you don't have that, then how do you justify land occupation? And how do you have a country, at least where the US is concerned, without that land occupation?
Yeah,
Yeah.
it makes it a lot easier for people to not even justify, because like they didn't have anything to do with that initial land grab, but it makes it a lot easier for them to accept that has happened, and for them to not feel guilt about what did happen.
Mm-hmm.
So they just sort of like, oh, it's all in the past, it's a fantasy world and they're fantasy people, and that's not remotely accurate, but it allows them to kind of have that disconnect with the real world.
Well,
And-
before we
sorry.
go too much further, because we're starting to cut into time for our next presentation, I wanted to mention two things. One, the whole imperialism idea just kind of made me think of like Make America Great Again.
Oh,
This this idea. It's like, oh, okay.
Yeah.
And the other thing is that I think, and this is something that we've been touching on, language is power. Right?
yes.
The use of language, how we construct it, how we appropriate it, how we say that a language is dead or dying,
Yeah.
changes that concept. And as long as we keep in mind that language is it defines our reality, you know.
Yeah.
And if we use words that define extinction,
Yeah.
and instead doesn't look at the fact that it's transformation into
Yeah.
something else, then we will continually perpetuate these ideas. And
Absolutely.
so, even for all of us, you know, addressing our language, addressing how we talk to students and we talk to peers and all of that,
Yeah.
we have to reassess our own colonized language
Yes.
as we go forward.
Yeah.
That being said, I want to take us on to our next presentation. So I want to welcome Lucor Jordan and was it Rachel Way? How do you pronounce your last name?
It's Waugh. You just
Waugh?
ignore the last three letters.
Okay, cool. Well, I want to thank you both for coming and presenting on your topic. I'm really looking forward to hearing what you have to say. So I'm going to go ahead and have you guys take it away.
Sounds great. Thank you so much. All right, let me get into present mode. 1 second.
And let me ask you a real quick question as well. Because you're doing a panel discussion, do you want to allow people to ask questions or to interject? Or do you want to do your own presentation and then we'll talk afterwards?
Yeah, I would love if people could interject.
Okay, cool. Then, if people want to jump on and have a comment, then do so appropriately. But yeah, okay, cool.
Great. Let me just make sure this is right. Okay. All right. Can everybody?
Yep, we can see that.
Awesome. Great. All right. So hi, I'm as Joseph introduced me. I'm really excited to be here. I actually had not heard of the High Plains Society until Lucor Jordan, who is a member, introduced me. So very, very excited to join you all. And today we're about the Museum of Food and Culture, which is a project that I am working on with Lucor and several other board members to establish in Colorado. And we have had a number of discussions as the board about the intersection of where museums and food and social justice can kind of unite and create a more equitable present. Lucor, do you want to do a little quick intro to yourself as well?
Yeah, so I think I was most initially attracted to this idea of the Museum of Food and Culture because it was presented as being more than just a passive and apolitical attempt to catalog culinary practice. It was, from the first time I heard about it, it was a very community engaged and collaborative idea that was ultimately trying to create a multi-vocal space where people could share food knowledge. And I feel like in our current context, that's something that I don't know, I feel like we're desperately in need of, is space where we can talk about what we know and learn what other people know and create kind of that, I don't know, very important space.
Awesome, thank you. All right, so moving on, just kind of quick outline of this, and full disclosure, Lucor and I were talking about this earlier. I did steal this outline from my thesis, plenty of these slides. I went to school in Pittsburgh to get my master's in food studies, and while I was there, and to create a Museum of Food and Culture, which I'll talk about a little bit more about in a second. But then we wanted to kind of integrate the anthropology standpoint, how to essentially expose people to other cultures without having it be kind of from this armchair and also people of all backgrounds into a space where they feel welcome and valued, especially since museums are not that everyone has felt valued in the past. And in thinking about this, we are touching on some of the kind of key concepts that occur in museums related to education and also material culture, particularly food, since it's a food museum, how to use food in a way that is really kind of this welcoming tool. And then we kind of give an overview about the museum. We have a couple activities for you all to do, and then I'll discuss at the end, because this is definitely a work in progress, and we would love to hear as well. So moving right along. To start with the interactive component, I would have people share 3-sentence memory about food. And since I wrote this, I can start. I have time to think about it. So my memory is, in my family, every birthday we take off as a holiday. Growing up, the first thing that would greet the birthday person morning were apple cinnamon muffins. And I have now taken on this tradition of cooking apple cinnamon muffins for every member of my family on their birthday. Lucor, would you like to go next?
Yeah. So I thought I would share a story from my childhood as well. One day, my cousin and I were walking along barefoot, and we got invited to pick raspberries in the yard of one of my uncle's friends. And so we'd picked all the raspberries that were easily reached. And so we decided to climb into the bush barefoot and try to pick as many raspberries as we could, which meant we had to be very careful. But the raspberries were so good that I knew I didn't want to end the enjoyment right then, so I wanted to save them. So I filled my shirt with as many raspberries as I could. And then I started to reach a little farther and farther until I just tipped over completely and fell into a pile of brambles, lost all my raspberries, and was just laying there bleeding, trying to like delicately pick the raspberries that were still in reach and not too crushed.
Both sad and amused, like very touching. I love that. All right, who would like to go next? Yeah, go for it.
Oh, sorry, I actually can't see that. Memory food for me is everything always goes back to my grandmother with food. She raised me with my mom, and every day when I would get home from school, there would be bacon like lying out ready for me, because she always cooked the bacon like the way that I like it, which is like honoring the fat in the bacon. And every day when I would go to school, it would be a poached egg. So going to school and coming home from school, there was always food as a way of sort of sending you off or welcoming you back into the house. I don't think I've ever seen someone come over to our house and be there for more than 5 minutes without being offered some sort of cheese or cracker plate. And it's never just an offer, it's that it appears magically before you.
I love that. Thank you, Jerry.
Can I share a story?
Yeah.
Lucor, you had so many funny and interesting parts of your story, but I'm wondering, do you have any childhood stories where you had shoes on? I think all of your stories out with and we were barefoot. Hello, everyone. My name is Michael again, for those who we haven't met before. I have a story, where I'm from, very much in the woods, right up against, if not in the mountains. And the particular area that I was from was not diverse. There was 12 or 13, they would call themselves, and I would call them, black kids that rode my bus. Some may prefer African American, but that's the way in which they still label themselves, but not so diverse. There was a huge nursery company where single men, predominantly from Mexico, would work there. But at that time, it wasn't like a economy thing to where families were there, like Greeley, where I live now, where it's, 65 to 70% Hispanic, and it's wonderful. So I remember when there was a supervisor of that nursery company that finally brought his whole family, and my sister made good friends with Yolanda Zamudio. So before that, it was just paste picante and hamburger with taco seasoning. And this story's already got too long. But the 3 sentences, I remember when Yolanda came over to our house and said, "Do you want real tacos?" and made us real Mexican street tacos with only onions and cilantro. And they were so good. And they're so commonplace where I live now and probably where you all live. But at that time, just that pungency of cilantro and, the first time like wondering, do I like this cilantro? Do I not? And now I just, I absolutely love it. And it was great. It was a great experience.
Well, thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. Definitely.
So when I was a kid, my grandparents would set out I'd come over for the weekend. My grandparents would set out a plate of ham and a plate of cucumbers. And throughout the entire day, I would be running in and out of the house. I would be running around with my friends down into the field. I would be gone for 8-10 hours. But every once in a while, I'd pop my head back in and just grab a piece of ham, and I'd roll it up, and then I'd eat it, or I'd grab a handful of cucumber and I'd take off with it. And it was something that, for years, every time I went over to my grandparents' house, they had plates of ham and cucumber. And I don't know, it was such a huge part of my life. Even to this day, I will cook a plate of ham and I will have a plate of cucumber. And, probably not the healthiest, but man, certainly nostalgic.
Yeah.
Yeah, here's my quick one. I have a quick one. My very first memory of watching a science fiction movie was Back to the Future, and eating 3 whole trays of my grandma's cinnamon rolls and getting violently ill with my 2 uncles who were my age, and then moaning in pain as we're watching the end of the Back to the Future movie.
I have a story. My mom was always open to learning how to fix different kinds of food. So in one house we lived in for about 4 years, our landlords were from Mexico. And that's where she learned about tacos and tostadas. Oh my God, and enchiladas. She learned that from the woman, Irma. And then a few years later, we moved back to Long Beach, California, and we lived next door to a lady from Italy. And I remember coming home often, and she would have strings between chairs with the noodles that she made by hand over the string. I just thought that was great. I think it was the foundation for me to become an anthropologist later, that we were so open to food, not just meat and potatoes and cabbage. We're Irish Catholic. So yeah, that's my food story, is the variety of food, being open to the tastes and such.
Oh, I love that. Thank you for sharing. Would anyone else like to share?
I can go next.
Mm-hmm.
So when I was growing up, we had my entire family is Italian. And so we used to have this feast of this 12 fishes, which is a kind of Roman Catholic holiday. And I remember all my cousins came around. So probably for Christmas Eve, we probably had about 20 to 30 people at a dining table. And we did this every year when I was a kid. And it is one of my best series of memories, because I got to hang around my cousins. And we did that for good 10 years until some people moved out of state, and still kind of close to some of my cousins, but that's one of my best memories.
I love that. Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you all for sharing. Is there anyone else who would like to say anything?
one sentence.
I'll tell a story. I'll try to make it 2 sentences. Sorry, I'm trying to aim this to my face because I'm on my phone. So my family is Italian, and when my uncle got married, my grandma wanted to make something traditional for his wedding. So we made cannolis. And this was the only time we ever did anything like this, but we had to make so many for this wedding that there were hundreds of cannoli shells like laid out on the bed on these sheets. And we spent hours and hours at the table like hand stuffing each of them with cheese. And it was very tedious, but they were tasty. So
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you. I'm sorry, I don't popping up right now, but you have amazing orange or grapefruit earrings. Would you mind? Sorry to cut you off.
Hi everyone, I'm Melissa, and having a lot of relatives from South Dakota, you learn really quick that when you're having salad for Christmas or Easter or just any dinner on the Sunday, like it's Jell-O. It's not salad with leaves, it's Jell-O. So whenever I go to grandma's and we're having salad, I just expect really good Jell-O.
Jell-O.
Love that. Awesome. All right. Anyone else?
I'll say something quick. Oh, can you see me?
Yep.
Oh, sorry. I can't see myself. That's okay. I was thinking about my grandparents from the San Luis Valley, from the town of San Luis in southern Colorado. And we had a lot of chili and onions and things there. And there's this like socialization process that, you know, a lot of pressure, but a certain kind of pressure that people want kids to get them to the where they're eating onions and stuff like that. So I remember not wanting to eat something that had raw onions in it when I was a little kid. And my grandpa saw me not eating the onions and he said, you don't like onions, huh? And I was like, well, I don't know, they're kind of gross. They're kind of like, they hurt my tongue. And then he said, are you a man or a mouse? And that was it. My answer was I started eating onions. And there's stories like that for many other foods. I won't go into those.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing. Well, great. Thank you everybody for sharing a little bit of a glimpse to your lives and into your background. I was telling Lucor right before this, one of my favorite things is whenever I tell people I'm creating a food museum, people always come up to me with their food stories. It's incredible. Like it's always something that piques people's interest and they always have a story for me. So I appreciate you. I am now going to share a little bit more about my story so you know why you're actually here and why we're doing this presentation. Origins of a food museum. So what is a food museum? It is what it sounds like, that study culture of food. This is not a very common thing, as you probably know. You've been in many different cities and probably a food museum, all of them. So this is a relatively new idea. And the way that I came to this was I was in undergrad, all sorts of different extracurricular activities, primarily focused around food and social justice. And I was curating / cooking for this multi-course, multi-sensory dinner that was going to accompany a dystopian play that my friend wrote. I think is maybe one of the most undergrad-like sentences ever to say. And this play thought a lot about the different components of the food world, thinking about environmentalism, feminism, animal rights, what have you. And this meal was supposed to be kind of the edible experience of that. And while I was brainstorming what foods we could serve with my friend who was like all the actors and everything, I kept coming back to this idea of why isn't there anywhere to discuss that, how we could have a panel discussion afterwards where people could really ask their questions that came up from the play about what is organic versus direct trade, and like, why does feminism matter in food studies? And it really surprised me where there's nowhere that you could go and really think about food in the context of justice or in interdisciplinary topics. And that was when it occurred to me, I would like to create a food museum that is a space where people are able to learn about, share their stories about food, and then ask questions where they have them in the gray spaces of food of, I want to cook a salad, or I want to cook, I don't know, something, make a salad tonight. And I could buy either organic or I could buy from a local producer. Which do I choose? Why am I choosing that? And really give people the kind of space to explore those different way that feels safe and valuable. And so then that put me to grad school in Pittsburgh, which I mentioned. So I got my master's in food studies, and my whole purpose of being there was trying to figure out how to create a food museum. And I focused a lot, actually, surprisingly, on education and history while I was there, and not as much on the food studies part of everything. But that definitely kind of some of the initial topic we're thinking about for the museum. So that's a little bit of my professional background. And now, Lucor, are you ready to share yours?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Oh,
right.
Sorry.
And you can go one more.
Oh, this one? Or
One more slide.
this is the slide.
Okay, cool. So I guess I want to answer, why is an anthropology of food more than just salvage ethnography or a centrally indulgent reflection? And so I think to address that, I would start kind of in the early days of anthropology or ethnology, when students of culture would enter the field and conduct ethnographic research. The two most immediately important questions that must be answered is how people ate, shared, and worked together. And this would help to explore why people lived where they do, why they spend time over here versus over there, how they assemble resources, how they share them with who, how family life is structured, and how social order is maintained. And all of this would fall under the fancy sounding phrase of a subsistence strategy. And so now, even as anthropologists enter the field and they no longer are looking to classify societies by means of production or subsistence strategy, they still find that the things that you begin to learn about people are the answer to the stomach question. What's for breakfast, what's for lunch or for dinner, and what are any delightful in-between meal snacks. And then also in instances of participant observation, commensality or shared meals are often one of the first times you get a backstage entree into community life. And in particular, as a cook and an anthropologist, I found that being handy with pots and knives and fire and stoves is a part of rapport building. But even more than that was being able to talk to people who cooked about food. And it kind of made me think about Bordeaux's work on habitus, and that a life in the kitchen will change how you see and talk about and engage with every aspect of feeding other people. And in looking at our current society, a peculiar characteristic is that the practice of cooking and feeding others, or feeding yourself, is increasingly divorced from that mainstream experience, which means that the way that people see food and the options for talking about it are becoming truncated. So here's a quote from Michael Carolyn's work, No One Eats Alone. And this is an interview with a marketing executive who worked for 40 years, starting in the 60s. Back in the 60s and 70s, we were really working to make that happen, to make people actually forget how to cook. The less we know about cooking, the less we do, which leads to knowing less, doing still less, and so forth, until we have no choice but to eat certain foods like those that have already been prepared for us. Then there's a point of no return. After a generation or two, societies will not even know that they have forgotten anything, as entire cohorts are born into this new normal. And so this quote kind of gets a glance behind the curtain of the food system, which is in the midst of rapid transformation and leads to a total restructuring of both our foodscape and our food system. And the food system is the supply chain. And so when we talk about the foodscape, that's all the things that exist outside of that, the human experience and the relationships between people and plants and foods and eating. But in looking more back at the food system, working in kitchens and grocery stores, I spent a lot of time behind the curtain a little bit that separates consumers from food production. And I got to see that we have the opportunity to eat things from far away, that our diet and the timing and location of the meals can be entirely removed from the people who are close to us in other parts of our lives. And we can also divorce our cooperative behavior, or teamwork as it's popularly called, entirely from the process of eating, and increasingly have no direct social relationships with anyone involved in the production or the preparation of our foods. There's further the opportunity for our labor to exist as an impersonal process of buying or selling of time, which we see no social profit is generated from our workday, and instead it is simply a drain on our ability to maintain growth-oriented social relationships. And I think in looking at this situation, another important quote I found inspiring was from a Denver Health and Environment Policy Scan report. And it stated that lack of access, availability, and affordability in healthy food results in serious health, economic, and social consequences for individuals and society. In fact, some of the most important public and environmental concerns of the 21st century are food security, obesity, and environmental sustainability. The food system and related agricultural policies that intersect with these health challenges are coming under increased scrutiny and are considered broken. And I feel like it's important to really focus on that idea of our food system being broken, because it's actually functioning exactly as it was designed to function. And so while the Health and Environment Report cited a broken food system, if we contextualize it within both settler colonialism and extractive colonialism, it's exactly where it should be. And in this, I kind of lean on Sidney Mintz's work, focusing on the historical context of control and exploitation within communities that has become structurally embedded into a continuous, into the present. These same structures are enduring. And acknowledging that this continuum of settler colonialism within the context of food becomes an important conversation, it shows us the consequence of, this has also been kind of accelerating through the industrialization that Marx talks about, where this, as workers are being pushed into unnatural structures, you're kind of being forced to pull yourself away from those relationships that would have existed. And so I think within the contexts of our food system being intentionally broken and our relationships to food being intentionally removed and adulterated, it's a little bit more than salvage ethnography to look at what's being lost, because I think without holding on to these things, we can, I think, pretty safely presume that our descendants are doomed. Another important part, I think, of the anthropology of food and a place in the Food Museum is that food and the relationships that we form with foods and with people and places and the times that go along with those are very important as far as our fundamental development. We are socialized through mealtimes. We learn the ins and outs of our societies, what's expected of us to become full participating young adults and adults. And we also learn about the structure of our in-group status. And we identify significant markers of authenticity that we have to learn in order to reproduce authentic culture, such as making authentic soup for our families. Coming from an awareness that in most cases people are happy to talk about food and listen to food, the anthropology of food and the museum of food have an opportunity to provide a multivocal space where people can have these conversations in the larger contexts of history and trauma. And I think also it can create a space where food can become a stepping stone to replace xenophobia with a shared enjoyment and understanding of the foods that people love. I think that pretty well frames where I am approaching this idea. But I think it's good to highlight that I see it especially valuable as an applied anthropology because of what's at stake in these times, that food justice and food security are things that need to be changed now and need to be addressed now. And it provides a very powerful call for moving forward. All right, that's what I had for that part.
Awesome. Yeah, so beautifully summed up. So when doing this research, museums, education, how food can potentially slip into there, I did this whole history of food in museums, which is actually super fun, and food a history in museums longer than I think most people maybe know about. But one of the things that kind of kept coming back to me is the fact that museums are so grounded in this colonial imperialist history, and they have a very vested interest in talking about whiteness and as the supreme goal, sort of, and framing exotic or unnatural, and also thinking about museums as Bourdieu-based, in terms of the fact that you're going to the museum to show that you have a particular level of taste in that you know to go to the museum, but also what you're consuming while there, and how you're able to effectively weaponize that sort of cultural experience, reinforce your whiteness and your privilege within a particular society. I'm sure you all know this because you're religious. So actually the part that I really wanted to touch on is how education is changing in contemporary museums. The American Association of Museums did a study in 2010, that transformation of the future of museums. And this was kind of the most recent study that looked at all museum visitors and said, we have primarily white and affluent individuals coming to museums, and they're consisting of about 91% of the museum visits, but they're decreasingly representing the national population at the 68.7%. At this point, we're going to lose our audience. And how do we change that? And a lot of this also rotated kind of around the idea that are older demographics, people who are age 16 to 25, do not go to museums for fun on the weekends. How to really reframe museums in kind of public discourse and reframe the experiences that people had in museums to broaden the audience, to get approachable to a variety of people. And this study looked at different ways contemporary museums were approaching these things, such as including more interactive exhibits, like art performances, and it discovered that essentially visitors are increasingly wishing to see experiences of others reflected in the collections and programming, in a way that it contributes to the overall kind of sense of human history and culture, and really participate in a captivating experience that they will take from them. So it's not just you were an art major and already have a background. People really wanted to go to a museum, be exposed to different things, learn about that, and take that in as an additional experience. So that's the diversity component. That has been, I'm sure if you've followed any museums, especially in boosting up their incorporation of different voices in the curation of their exhibits, also in the actual programming that they end up choosing. The next component that I wanted to think about was experiential learning. And this was something that came back to me again and again throughout my food studies experience, thinking of experiential learning as a continual process that is grounded in the visitor's experience, and really meeting people where understanding food and museums, posing additional questions, and then giving them space to reflect on that, and kind of this kind of continual growing process. And I saw that sensory museology was a way to increase access. So incorporating multisensory exhibits can engage people in the same way that when you were a kid, you probably were assigned a kindergarten project and digging. And you learn things that you didn't necessarily learn while doing that kind of independence, building on that experience. And finally, participatory. So this is the idea of having the visitor as a co-creator, essentially giving exhibits where visitors can feel like their experience is valued, and also they're able to contribute their experience to the museum, giving them a sense of ownership in the museum. And the goal of this is to really collect and share diverse, personalized, and changing content that is produced with visitors. So really an effort to democratize the museum. Why food? Food is a great method for because food, as we've already discussed, is so interdisciplinary. It's very multisensory, so anyone has approach to it widely sees themselves as a food expert in their own context. And for museums, it's really a wonderful way to reinvigorate visitor participation and reimagine educational approaches. And in an article called The First Course, A Case for the Food Movement, Moon and Stanton describe how incorporating food into historical and cultural spaces invite visitors to contextualize their own experience, behaviors, and lives, and further assist development of critical thinking and decision-making skills. So using food provides this very accessible entry point for people that can then go deeper in the way that you would want an educational community space to go. So this led to the Museum of Food and Culture, and this is where we started. So in last fall, actually, I did this nonprofit and started recruiting people. Happily found Lucor. This museum is intentionally co-creating a community for which food is the bridge between history, cultures, and individual stories. Spark excitement in this discovery of history and culture, connect voice from across the food system, thinking about industry to individual, policies to community, and history to future technology. experiences that inspire curiosity and discussion beyond our walls, unity through cross-cultural, multi-perspective conversations, and unite our values of equality, equity, and inclusion with. And here is the educational approach. These words will look familiar because they're exactly. So thinking about different ways to incorporate diverse identities and experiences in the global community in a way that is very intentional and gives and provide agency for the individuals with different individual, there we go, words, have experiential learning processes, essentially, where people can do hands-on taste tests and workshops where they can really engage in thoughtful learning, making it community and story of seeking and valuing the experiences as we're co-curating these exhibit programs. All right. And so, Lucor, I just want to give you a second. Do you want to add anything to those components?
I think just what I'd like to add is the reflection that approaching the presentation and education of food in this way very much simulates the way that we're introduced to it when we're young. That as like all these new things are introduced to us, they make sense because they're, experiential. We're tasting, we're smelling, we're holding, we're manipulating the food, and we're participating in the cooking as we learn how to cook. And then part of the participation of being kind of that multivocal space is asserting your place at the table to speak. And I think that's a really important part of having a collaborative exploration of food, is placing that co-equality where people can say, I guess something that's special about food conversation is anything that's associated with eating, serving, or preparing food is fair game as a segue in a conversation around food, where a lot of other subjects that people can talk about, there's a lot more pressure to stay on the same page. But just as we saw when each of us shared that 3-second story, you get a whole world of information, and it's all appropriate because it sits around that kernel of commensal conversation.
Definitely. Awesome. Yeah, and just to reiterate that, Lucor is exactly right. Having the experiential components that are engaging, like when we were kids, like when we were in kindergarten, and we're essentially relearning how to learn in community spaces and how to observe what things feel like and what things taste like and what sounds we're hearing from can really create a much more exciting exhibit, because the history of museums kind of coinciding with how science developed places absurd amount of emphasis on visual experiences and other senses, but this wasn't always the case. So really kind of bringing back other senses into a museum experience is something that is valuable and also makes it feel more approachable. You don't have to have any particular set of knowledge before you enter this space, and you can really you're able to engage in the participatory programming, feeling like your experience in the museum and before the museum, all valuable things. All right, so now to kind of do an example of, actually, I also wanted to mention, as we're kind of thinking of all of these educational approaches and our mission and our value are thinking about how this relates to our current situations with the pandemic and also with the social, taking a more forefront in current political discussion, and really thinking about food as a way that can engage and do engage in different social justice aspects. The next activity is kind of framed in such a way of how people typically think of kind of their activism, to use that word, or consumer activism, I think is a better phrasing of it, to really explore kind of what that means and how that intersects with other topics. So this is an activity everyone will do. So the first minutes, but we're going to ask you to list labels / classifications of food that hold meaning for thinking about organic, local, fair trade, whatever, the grocery store, and you're like, oh, that gives me like a little bit more, do that and try and buy that. So take a few moments and write them down if you feel comfortable. We are that list later, so if you have a written reference, that might be good.
Do you mean like hold meaning for us on a personal level, like
yes.
What we would prefer? Okay.
Yeah, like when you're at the grocery store, if you see organic tomatoes versus organic tomatoes, does organic have any kind of significance for you?
Okay, cool, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Definitely. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Definitely.
Yeah.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
And,
yeah.
and
Thinking about that too, how different products are labeled as authentic, and whether that is supposed to hold more meaning for you. I think definitely really, really interesting.
I
Mhm.
noticed at the store near me, the grocery store near me, the same thing when I need to get Ortega chilies.
Mhm.
And it's in the same kind of categorization as you were saying, Joseph. And I'm thinking, this is othering that food. They're making it other. So yeah, it's so embedded in the processes and structure of our markets. You know, these terms, these concepts, and they are settler colonialism. That is the origin of that.
Yeah, and you can also see the process of the shift of white ethnic groups into the white mainstream as, you know, like Italian food is no longer in the ethnic section of a market.
Right.
Or, you know, like German cuisine is kind of the sauerkrauts next to the ketchup.
Yes, yes, yes.
Yeah. Exactly. The Americanization of the grocery store.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the African cuisine is still kind of invisible, where you'll find occasionally teff by itself with other grains, but you'll find like certain other important ingredients, but they're not clustered together because they're not recognized as a popular foodway yet.
Could I interject a comment?
Yeah.
Yes.
You all are making me think too much, and that's scary. I want to start out with Lucor. Lucor brings to our attention culture change. When I was a graduate school, when the dinosaurs were roaming, culture was culture. And culture change was this other bizarre thing over here. And we learned that Raymond Firth wrote
Yeah.
a book called We the Tikopia,
Yeah.
which was so groundbreaking because it was about culture change. Lucor's point is so important
Yeah.
that all culture changes, and that what was once exotic is now, I don't know, us and mainstream, or what was once them is now us. And okay, having said that out of one side of my mouth, the other side says this kind of compartmentalization, it may not have the pungency of Trump and company, but it is polarization. This is our food and this is their food. And it is, I like a lot of kinds of their food. And it is always, I mean, it's gotten to the point of comical,
Yeah.
where Hebrew or kosher stuff is in with Chinese and Mexican and Japanese, and it's this great mass of other, undifferentiated other.
Mhm.
That's, with us, there's a lot of internal differentiation. There's fresh vegetables, canned vegetables. I don't need to go through a grocery store, but there's very clear differentiation between aisles, within aisles, and it's all ours.
Mhm.
But then there's this total de-differentiation, this kind of our food. I don't know. This is, I guess, is being recorded too, so I could get thrown in jail. It's a way almost of saying our food, their garbage. I mean, if it's, I know they want to, the stores want to sell it, so they're not going to call it garbage, but it's, ours is real food, and we're going to shove it over in the corner. I don't know what to call it. Um, but it is, I even, I trust my gut reaction so much in applied anthropology and everything in life. When I walk into that exotic section, my body feels different. My stomach turns. I feel I feel like constructing a conspiracy theory. I'm exaggerating, but
Mhm.
I want you to. Can I give you a suggested experiment?
Mhm.
Go through almost any kind of store and see what your emotions and body are telling you in the different parts of the store. Um, when you get to the exotic, and it's not always called that, of course.
Right.
It's called ethnic.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we're not ethnic. Everybody's ethnic, right?
Yeah.
It's but our ethnic is normal, so we don't need to call it ethnic.
Right.
Um,
It's true.
and I bet you will notice an emotional, physical difference between when you're walking in the normal us part of the store, and when you go fishing in that other part. It feels like strangers in a strange land. Um,
It's true.
I don't want to lose the Lucor's extremely important point that, and I know I'm putting words into your mouth, Lucor, forgive me, what you have to do is to take time-lapse photography over 100 years in the same grocery store or the same supermarket to see what's over here is Italian and Greek and German, in many instances disappears and becomes just part of normal stuff, so that German sauerkraut is now among sauerkraut in a lot of places. And you can go on and on and on. But with all of the devastating polarization, and who needs Trump's walls? We have all these other walls,
Yeah.
including language walls, that are certainly there, and they make a big difference in the feel of welcome and unwelcome. At the same time, Lucor's point is for all applied anthropology, because it's so easy to reify groups, whether they're Indian tribes, whether they're corporations. So thank you, Lucor, and it's all your fault that I talk so much.
If I could mention something real quick, I think that for one, this conversation has definitely made me hungry.
Yeah.
I was thinking this evening, I think I want to go have Mexican food.
I do too.
I'm thinking that I'm going to go to Taco Bell. And the question that I think needs to be brought up is this conception of corporate identity and appropriation of food, and I like Taco Bell, but Taco Bell is not Mexican food. It is not. It is commercialized. It is blanded down so that it is palpable to all kinds of tasteless white Americans that can't deal with spice. So and that's why Taco Bell is so successful. But I think having this conversation about not only how food is sold, but how it is presented in mass, in our concepts of like Chinese food is, if you go to a Chinese food restaurant here in Denver, is it going to be the same as Chinese food somewhere in China? And the likelihood is no, it's not, but it's because it's been Americanized and kind of dumbed down. But the other thing I need to bring up is the fact that we've gotten to a point in our time that we're sort of running over a little bit. So if the next presentation doesn't mind waiting a few extra minutes for you guys to process this last bit of your presentation, I think we should move forward semi quickly. Although I'm loving the conversation, so.
Yeah, definitely loving the conversation, and an excellent point too about like kind of corporate America taking particular identities and making them more palatable. For a long time by different example emphasize the sweet and spicy, and they're in the late 1800s and early 1900s to make them more palatable to white Americans, and a huge amount of stigma. So definitely a huge, since we don't have time to go to the activity, I did leave you all with this thought of how do museums fit into social justice and advocacy, and where specifically would a food museum foster this in advocacy? Like, we just had a really compelling conversation about grocery stores and the American in the grocery store on restaurant and per food, and like how do you kind of navigate this space between ideas of how do they facilitate these sorts of conversations, which we can talk about or not, because I don't want but that's been a big discussion for us in the board of what is our role in shaping conversations like these.
Well, if I can interject real quick, I just got word from Michael and Alyssa, who are our next presentation, that they're saying, hey, we should keep going with this discussion with what you're talking about. So, if you're okay with that, we can continue moving on with some of your stuff, because this is all very interesting and all very poignant things to be discussing, because food is, I think, oftentimes overlooked. When we're talking about the cultural landscape and all of that stuff, and it's a very subconscious thing that we observe as a culture, how we deal with food and even how we process, and like asking kids, one of my favorite things is like, where does milk come from? Well, it comes from the store. It doesn't come from cows. Well, what about chocolate milk? Well, it comes from brown cows.
Yeah.
These ideas of how do we teach the next generation how to deal with food and access, and with understanding how that food comes to them and how it's processed. We've got generations of people that don't know how their food is made.
Yeah.
And I think this is such a vital aspect to culture, just to be able to sustain ourselves. Keep going. Bring up the next subject.
Well, I guess I could point to where I think a strong place for the museum to exist inside of social justice, and that is that right now a lot of people have inherited a food system that has options that they don't realize exist, and has microaggressions that they feel like are inevitable. So what I see this museum space as being is a place where people can evaluate how they're accessing food and sharing food, and then look at how it could be something different than it is. So kind of to use like a garden analogy, we split between our work and our grocery shopping and our home life. We're watering several different plots of social relationships. We're engaging with our coworkers, we're engaging with trying to hopefully create a community space in our market or restaurant or whatnot. And then we're trying to put that energy into our family and friend network. And the conversation I'd love to see in the Museum of Food and Culture is, to what degree can we combine these plots and make the work that we do actually working towards either bringing food to us or directly accessing food? And how do we stop depleting ourselves by working hard and not seeming to build anything meaningful?
Could I violate my own rule and add some more? Because my motor mouth, as a few people call me. This fits in so much in the kind of meta picture, the bigger picture of teaching applied anthropology. This goes back to Mikkel's presentation this morning and Michael's about teaching people applied anthropological concepts on their own home ground, so that if you were to write down the 10 or 15 key ethnological, ethnographic concepts you want to convey in a 2, 3, 4 week period, and then you can say, well, let's do it all around food. Everybody in the room, in the classroom of 5 people or 60, goes to a grocery store, supermarket, to something. And so let's walk down the aisles, and we can illustrate every pea picking concept that you want to. And you can do the same thing with Michael's fictional worlds, conveying, you know, how about a science fiction story of going to a grocery store in an imaginary 5,000 years from now? We can, I mean, if at a meta level, you think so far the entire conference about doing research, about consulting, about teaching, about all of it, you could take each one of our specific subjects, most currently food, and say, okay, I can teach everything that I need to teach through the grocery store, or through what's in your refrigerator, or whatever. It's the the ordinariness of all of this,
Yeah.
to the point that nothing is exotic.
Right. Yeah.
Well, I think that, taking that practical approach, right? We've been talking about this, kind of all day about, the practical side of anthropology and how do we address, um, culture and how do we teach about it. And the grocery store, again, is a great example of, how we organize food. I mean, just organizing food, right? How do we, put certain types of food in certain parts of the store, and how, we've gotten to the point where we talk about when we're shopping at the store that, you should basically kind of focus on the outside, the ring of the store, and kind of avoid the center of the store because that's where all the processed foods are. So, I think uh, taking that sort of understanding of like how we have constructed our environments and how the corporate world has constructed a lot of these ideas about how we should have access to our food and to our resources, can be a very good tool to talk to students about and talk to folks and say, Michael, you're working with the Lakota and you're out there and they want to build a grocery store. How do you construct that grocery store that fits that community better than the community on the outside, that's out there? What's the best way to build this that makes it functional to them? And that's why anthropology is so cool and so important, is because we can do that. We can talk to people and figure out, what works best for you. So this conversation with food is just fantastic. God damn it! I love all you guys. This is just great.
Yeah,
I'm so excited I can barely contain myself.
When we're considering stuff like that too, it's back to Eric Wolf, man. Production, distribution, consumption. What are the dynamics and all of that stuff, right? What happens at the production sites of food? What happens at the distribution? And then how do we all consume it, right? So looking at those different levels is so critical.
Yeah, absolutely.
Rachel, could I bring a few things up?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, this has been awesome. I mirror what everyone else has said thus far, and you are making me think about a lot. I mean, that and then Joe started talking about also the corporate identity and appropriation of food, and I've a long time thought about the commodity fetishism of food.
Yeah.
You all have really enlightened me to think about a lot of other things. I mean, years ago, I certainly is more privileged than many people, but I had a choice I could make because of my privilege, and I choose to go to school. And with kids, that could be really hard. And I remember oftentimes walking into a grocery store, like to buy a box of brownies, like mixed brownie mix. And because that didn't happen much when I grew up, everything was homemade. I can't count the amount of times I've walked through a grocery store and felt guilty because I was going to buy processed products, even as much as like cake mix, you know? So I've thought about those things for a long time.
Yeah.
But you all have caused me to think about other things like even the mystification of a family meal. So, not even the food itself, but that concept of sitting down at a family table. And some families don't eat at tables. You know, my Iraqi and Emirati friends, you know, sitting down around what's that called, a Seder. Things like that are beginning to be commodified to where families won't even do it unless they go somewhere and pay for it. So they're separated by their labor. I'm trying to tie in Mark's here because you did that, Jordan, all day long, and then they spend that money just to bring the people back together at a restaurant somewhere. So I mean, so pretty soon to where the Seder or the fluffy pillows, pardon me for not knowing the language, that go around a certain room, like as some of our Arab friends, or the kitchen table is going to be a relic that could one day be in a food museum. And I'm not excited about that. So as cultural anthropologists, I mean, that's something that we can do. You know, we can, through our conversations and through social justice and advocacy at a food museum, hey, you know what? People don't need to appropriate your family time at your home. You can still, you don't have to pay for through cash or the development of a sixth McDonald's in your city. You can still have somewhat control over how that goes on in your home through that preparation and those spiritual practices and that cultural reverence that goes along with preparing food. And even if you decide to use box food, still that family experience does not have to be mystified and commodified. And one more thing about that, just social justice and advocacy, I really can't think of anything greater than food that brings people together. So museums are so at least in this country, I'm sure it's different in China and stuff, but in this country, museums are so whitewashed because, you know, it was super ethnocentric and stuff for this preservation and this, you know, in the museums, infinity goes on trial. You know, a lot of indigenous ways of thinking, all things are living and they continue. You know, they're not ever supposed to be put on a shelf. So there's already this whitewash visitation that you all talked about in your talk. But food is something that, I mean, I've never met a person from a particular group, however that group be identified as, that at least one person in that group didn't love food and have amazing stories about it. So just bringing people together and diversifying the museum experience, whether it's a building or virtual, can bring up so many new topics and draw in funding, because funding is objective just like everybody else, everything else and everybody else, but even bring in funding sources and think about science in new non-white ways. And it all came together through food and people start to visit and have conversations to what we think of as a museum, but it's much more than that because of what you all are doing. So thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Speaking of all this food ways and all this stuff, I have an article that's called The Social Life of the Tortilla. And it's about like the history of commodity fetishism and how the tortilla has evolved over the last 500 years. I linked it in the comments. It's by Lind and Barham, if you're watching this and can't see the link. But it's a great one I use in class to talk about how food has evolved in relation to both colonization and commoditization. So
I'd like to bring up something that you guys made me think of, and sort of we were talking about like the space in which we eat, and I started thinking about like the TV meal, the ready to eat meal that has, you know, not only sort of changed like how we eat and where we eat, you know, we have lost the dinner table and have found the couch. you know, and you know, dinner time might, especially with like kids, you know, dinner's on, but you know, there's got to be a cartoon on in the background or a movie on in the background, or there's always something else going on, and how technology has impacted just the everyday technology, you know, the TVs and you know and tablets and computers, and how we've integrated all of this stuff into our normal daily activity, and how that has distracted us from, you know, the just the common dinner meal where it's about, you know, that community. And so I think it's kind of fascinating to kind of look at not only like this historical context but the technological context, and how we've adapted to this concept of like food preparation, that microwave meal that we can just toss in real quick, was basically, you know, advertised as like eliminate, you know, an extra 25 minutes out of your busy day, you know, just toss it in the oven or toss it in the microwave and you've got that food.
Yeah.
And so it becomes time saving, you know, and whether or not it's healthy, it doesn't matter. Whether or not it tastes as good as a home cooked meal doesn't matter. It's now about time, and how does time become an aspect of a meal, you know, and what do we do with that extra time by sitting in front of the TV, or working at the same time, you know, how many times have we all sat and had to write a paper or, you know, graded or done something like that, and we've got our food right here next to us as we're doing it, and it takes away from, you know, whether or not it's subsistence, or whether it's just a communal thing, and then also looking at like the nuclear family, right? Whether or not we've got small group families, you know, parents and kids, and there's 4 or 5 people around the table, or whether or not we live in a large family complex with 20 people, you know, and how is food made and shared, and so yeah, I think there's so much. Got so much. So
I think
much
we could briefly segue into providing our answers to that exercise. I think that's a good kind of point in thinking about the values that are associated with foods, because you brought up the other one, which is like ready to eat or quick. So, you know, it's not just organic or local or fair trade, but maybe doesn't take any cooking is one. So maybe we could go around briefly to finish, and if anyone has something to share in that.
Are we sharing now? Or?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay.
So just wanted to really quick throw in this really interesting link. The New York Times did a article recently on food insecurity and hunger in the US with a focus on the pandemic and thinking about the way that food is surely in food insecure communities. It was only a slight component of it, but I think it's a really interesting article, very beautifully presented, and has that component of when food is scarce, how is there still community? So if y'all want to check it out, I just threw it in the chat. For people who might be viewing it, it's called America at Hunger's Edge, and it was published September 2nd of this year. So.
I had a bunch of different things to say, but there's just so much going on. Yeah, I'm working on some different stuff with food right now in my job, so I really appreciate all this discussion of it. And I think like a couple things that came up is one thing that we just got approached about was like a native plant garden for the Ute Museum in Montrose. And so just thinking about like, you know, basically very applicable to what you just said and kind of how to frame that and align it with the mission of my organization and bring it into the present, basically. How to use a museum as a tool in the present instead of simply the tool of preservation. So that's definitely something that resonated with me a lot. And yeah, I can't even think of all the things right now. Just regarding the labels, there's a lot of stuff with that. I mean, I guess I always appreciate having you, Lucor, here to talk about food because, you know, I worked for a coffee, I was in coffee sales for a while. And then sometimes I forget about the relevance of that to anthropology. And I'm like, and then I remember like, oh yeah, there's a lot there. And seeing, like you said, behind the curtain, you know, there's a ton there in just terms of how you think about the labeling. I mean, one thing to think about the labeling is just a lot of it is very, very contrived. Even the positive messaging is, you know, I mean, like we would sell the same bag of coffee and you could pay and you could put the label on it, or you can not pay and you don't put the label on it. It's the same thing. And how is the labeling really, you know, what's the real effect and impact of the labeling? Is it a symbolic gesture? Is it important to have that symbol? Where does the money from the labels actually go to? There's a lot of questions, you know, in that, and how does it maybe box out people that have a product that's, you know, better, but they don't want to pay for the labeling, or they don't have the ability to pay for the labeling because they don't hit X, Y, Z requirements. So yeah, I don't know. There's a lot of different things to talk about there too. That's what I wanted to say.
Well, I do want to wrap up because we went really over time. Thank you so much to the next people that are present, which I think is Michael and Alyssa. I just shared the presentation link. You guys can do the activities on your kind of a description. It's going a little bit more into the food labels, and then also into kind of the significance of museum experiences, and then how to kind of unite those two. But I want to give a huge shout out to Lucor. This has been an awesome discussion, and I would have never known about it without him. So thank you so much. And I wanted to thank you all for being such a great audience and very interested in exploring like all the different aspects about food. This was really cool for me to join, and I'm excited to see the next presentation too. Yep, so that's for me.
Well, thank you, Rachel, and thank you.
Oh,
Lucor.
and
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
Oh, I was going to ask if there's somewhere I could post the presentation link so that other people can view it. Lucor said there are people watching on Facebook.
We could probably post it onto the YouTube page.
Oh yeah.
As a link. So post it there. That way, people that are out there watching, and then that'll also be a good place for that. If people want to go back and look after the meeting is done, we'll have a good outlet.
I'll grab it and do it. I got it.
Cool. Thank you, Mike.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. First of all, I really want to thank you too for such an outstanding presentation and really bringing along and making us aware about the importance of food. I mean, it should be obvious, right? I mean, we all eat pretty much every day, multiple times a day, sometimes even, and understanding how important not only what we're doing and how we're doing it and why we're doing it, is continually something that I think gets overlooked, especially in our culture where time is of the essence, and ease of access is of the essence, and so I think even just the concept of having a food museum that can allow people to explore different ideas and different thought patterns about how we consume is absolutely fantastic, and making me hungry. So I appreciate that very much, and I think on that, unless anyone else has anything they want to say, we'll move on to Michael and Alyssa. Kenzie, did you have something you wanted to say? Oh, you're muted. You're still.
I think I just said it in the chat. I was just really enjoying it, and I just think like it speaks again to that sort of that I feel like there's kind of a theme happening here, which is like reinventing the way that we see things and then reinventing the applications, but more so like enabling other people to apply it. So I just really appreciated that part of like this idea of our approach to museums and our idea of the approach to like the materials that we use for those museums and bringing that out and bringing the participation out from that. But like inviting other people to kind of do their own work with it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And if I can just comment on that, I think about, again, it's this concept of language where we have a term like museum, and what is the connotation behind a museum? And it usually has that historical, past tense, the Museum of Nature and Science, and oftentimes it's dealing with things in the past or things that we consider to be in the past and not always issues that are contemporary or changing organically. And so, changing that narrative, changing the terminology, might be a really interesting thing to really contemplate on how we address. I was looking at your even like your title, for the museum has Greek origins, right?
Mhm.
It's got that Western, it looks like a Greek structure where you've got pillars that are made out of a fork, a spoon, and a knife. And that right there was like, I was sitting there going like, yeah, no, that totally reminds me of a museum, but it totally reminds me of a museum.
Yeah.
So I think even like that kind of context, you're making something that's obviously a connection to what people think of as a museum, but maybe thinking about how you can restructuralize that, and I don't know, but I think having that as a consideration might be something worthwhile.